is there anything in terms of avoidance that you would do? Like I try to, and this is kind of why I wanted to have you on. This makes sense in my head, but I wanted to go to someone who has a higher level of expertise on this specific subject, right? If I know that my client is going to do an interval run tomorrow where they need to have that faster pace, they need to be able to generate a little bit more force. I'm not necessarily going to put the heavier lift the day before, where I might be more keen to doing that the day before a long run. Like, hey, you're going to, it's a longer run, but it's going to be easier in terms of your effort level. Like, you'll be fine, go run it out. So how do you, if you're going to pick a day to do something heavy, would you generally avoid that before a more intense like interval run or a speed day?
Yeah, like I would always put, or for myself, at least for this training plan, the heavy days are before like 2-hour runs where your heart rate's at, 150, no pushing. But usually I'll set it up like Monday is intervals, 800-meter repeats, whatever, speed work, lift, do like some kind of mid-distance run, and then the long run, because it kind of builds up to that. Whatever, it could be 2 hours, 20 miles. It just depends. But yeah, I usually don't program high volume or any kind of like metabolic conditioning before something like half-mile repeats.
So another thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the kind of the sets and reps, basically, in terms of how to program those. Because for, let's say, football, right? You've got, or even volleyball, like basketball, these are all burst sports. So the idea of going quick and powerful for a very short amount of time is on some level mimicking the needs of the sport. Well, if your sport is ultimately race day, just consistency over time, that, like, obviously everyone can use speed and power, but there seems to be that you would need more repeat rhythm type of something in your training for that. Is that something that you try to implement in the weight room? And if so, how? Or do you just say, like, that's what the running training is for, and I don't really mess with that thought in the weight room?
Yeah, so the goal as a runner is to not, like, I'm not so concerned about reps or exact sets. It's more so having the right movements in the right order. So it's, I'll have some days where it's super heavy back squats mixed with, like, a plyometric movement to work on explosiveness, because when you run, that force production, like anything I pick up from the ground, I want to be able to lift heavy weights, because that translates into, your foot strike when you pull off the ground with running. So a lot of strength training is more so mimicking your running stride, but taking the mechanics and using weight with it. So I think it's less about like how much you do and more about what you do.
What about tempo? Like, how much do you think about tempo in the weight room?
So with endurance runners, like, even if I say lift heavy, like, usually people think that's, 5 reps or so. But with running, you want to be able to still have that metabolic element. So I try and usually do 10 set reps of everything and then mix it with some kind of explosive movement to kind of get that muscle exhaustion. So the more, you build up glute medius, hamstrings, the less fatigue I'm going to feel at hour 1 on a 2-hour run.
An analogy I've always used that I think helps clients that I'll throw at you and see what you think of it is the idea of stress on a muscle, right? Yeah. And so what I would say is, like, like you're saying, like if your hamstring is stronger, each step is causing less stress. So if the world's strongest man were to pick up a 500-pound weight versus I would try to pick up a 500-pound weight versus 110-pound, 5'3" female client tries to pick up a 500-pound weight, it's the same 500 pounds. Me and the female client probably aren't going to be able to move it at all. The world's strongest man is going to be able to pick it up like it's nothing. And so, but it's still 500 pounds. A step is still a step. The stronger you are, the less stressful it is. Is that hold up for you?
Yeah, and I think with runners, it's interesting because I'm less concerned about, how much you can lift, because you'll notice, like, if you take a lot of not a lot, but some, big time athletes that can do these, huge lifts and stuff. And then you ask them to balance on one leg while catching a tennis ball. And it's like, oh my God, what? Like, have I ever done this? So I think it's also, doing the right exercises that translate to muscle growth in the right places to prevent injury. But at the same time with running, it's a lot of, you're on one leg 100% of the time. So you want that isolated stability, and there's so many elements that are overlooked with just like, stationary movement.
That was actually going to be my next question. What do you think are the biggest mistakes that trainers make when training runners, or that runners make when they're training themselves?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think what I see with people, not so much novice runners, but maybe like people who don't really do strength training, they think like push-ups, squats, like, the very basic things. And I don't think there's not a whole lot of like training certs for learning the mechanics of running. And if there are, but they're not talked about, it's more like you always see barbell mechanics, kettlebell workshops, which is great. But I think more trainers need to, take some kind of course or cert on the actual mechanics of the stride cycle. Because when you see it, you're like, oh, that's a single leg deadlift, or the triple extension translates to box jumps, whatever kind of thing. But you don't think about that unless you either do the sport or have knowledge.